Thank you for being here today. The title of my dissertation is Production and Perception of Reduced Speech and the Role of Phonological Orthographic Consistency. For my dissertation, I look at production and perception of reduced pronunciations and their relationship with orthography for speakers of Japanese as a first and second language. The big picture of my research is to study about how humans process spoken language using multiple sources of language information in order to deal with variability in casual speech, which contains many instances of articulatory undershoot. In particular, I'm interested in how knowledge of literacy helps or hinders in the process of such variability. The big picture of my research can be broken down into two components. First, how production of speech varies and how listeners interact with such variability. In particular, I'm interested in production and perception of phonetic reduction, which is characterized by incomplete articulation of segments. In everyday interactions, our speech is produced in a casual manner, and such speech contains a higher degree of variability. Such variation is called phonetic reduction, where segments or even syllables can be altered or deleted. For example, in English, yesterday could be pronounced as yeshe, and in Japanese, daigaku might be pronounced as daigaku. Interestingly, despite the fact that reduced pronunciations are more common than unreduced counterparts, especially in the casual speech, unreduced pronunciations are easier to process. The reason for that could be because of orthography, more specifically, the consistent relationship between the unreduced pronunciations and their orthographic forms, which leads us to the second component of my research. How orthography influences spoken language comprehension. In particular, I'm interested in the effect of the pronunciation to spelling consistency, where inconsistent words are more difficult to process than consistent words. The influence of orthography in spoken word recognition has been observed by a number of studies. Many of them concerned pronunciation to spelling consistency, and they found slower response times and higher error rates for inconsistent words. For example, in English, the words keep and deep are inconsistent words, as the rhyme of these words, eep, can be spelled in multiple ways, either EEP or EAP. But the word luck is a consistent word, as the rhyme of the word uck can be spelled in only one way, UCK. Put these two research aims together and I can formulate the research question. How does phonetic reduction interact with the pronunciation to spelling consistency? Almost all of the previous research has examined the consistency effect using careful pronunciations. However, as discussed earlier, spoken language is highly variable, especially in casual speech, which suggests that the phonetic realization of a given word could be substantially inconsistent with its spelling. My question is that inconsistency between the way yesterday is pronounced and spelled greater for the casual pronunciation than for the careful pronunciations? Or does that phonetic realization matter for the effect of consistency? Previous research shows that when reduced pronunciations were presented with conversational speech-like contexts, there is no effect of consistency. Research also shows that effect of reduction overweights the effect of consistency. I should point out that the research findings discussed so far are based on the assumption that phonological representations are acquired prior to orthography. However, many second language learners acquire phonological and orthographic representations simultaneously, or their acquisition of orthography may even precede the acquisition of phonological representations. For second language learners, the effect of orthography interacts with their proficiency level, where advanced learners show the effect of orthography. This is because for advanced learners, the orthographic information can be activated through phonological representations. However, for beginners, since they have not yet fully established phonological and orthographic representations, these two representations cannot interact with each other effectively, meaning that the orthographic information cannot be activated via phonological representations. I should also point out that the research findings discussed so far are based on the alphabetic languages. Therefore, in my dissertation, I extended their investigation to a logographic language, specifically Japanese. Japanese also showed the effect of consistency, but the mapping process between the pronunciation and the spelling is not straightforward, as you can imagine. Therefore, for Japanese, the degree of pronunciation to spelling consistency is calculated based on the number and the frequency of phonological and orthographic neighbors of a given word. Japanese also shows phonetic reduction, as I mentioned earlier, such as daigaku could be pronounced as a daigaku. My question is, does the phonetic realization matter for the effect of consistency in Japanese? In order to address these issues, I conducted 3 studies, 1 production study and 2 perception experiments. First, I conducted a corpus analysis examining the phonetic reduction across different styles of speech. And then I created reduced and unreduced pronunciation stimuli, simulating the result of the corpus study. Then, using these stimuli, I conducted 2 pupillometry experiments, investigating how reduced pronunciations interact with the effect of pronunciation to spelling consistency for L1 Japanese speakers and for L2 Japanese speakers. This is a summary of all the findings related to my research aims. First, I found greater reduction for more spontaneous speech style. For example, in the corpus study, I investigated distribution and degree of phonetic reduction across 4 styles of speech by investigating the effect of speech style on the realization of word medial voice stop and word medial nasals. I used 3 measurements: the percentage of absence of a complete closure, duration, and intensity difference of target segments. My findings revealed that the smallest intensity difference was found in dialogue, which is the most spontaneous speech style, for all the phonemes except for a molar nasal. And intensity difference measure demonstrated the most consistent effect of speech style. Second, reduced pronunciations cause both L1 and L2 listeners to incur additional processing costs. For example, this figure shows the grand average of pupil dilation over time for reduced and unreduced pronunciations in the delay naming task for native speakers. Y-axis shows the degree of pupil dilation. Greater pupil dilation indicates more cognitive effort. And x-axis shows the time. In this task, participant first looked at the fixation cross. and then they heard the Japanese word. They then waited until pure tone was presented. Then they repeated the word they heard. As you can see, pupil dilation becomes greater over time, and reduced pronunciation induced greater dilation than unreduced pronunciations. For non-native listeners, we can see the comparable patterns to what we saw in the native listeners. But the difference between two pronunciations are not as large as native listeners. This is possibly because of the fact that it doesn't matter if words are reduced or not. Some words are difficult to comprehend for non-native listeners, particularly for beginners due to the limited size of vocabulary. Third, I found that the pronunciation to spelling consistency affects spoken word recognition, particularly for reduced pronunciation for both native and non-native listeners. For example, this figure shows the interaction between consistency and time for unreduced and reduced pronunciations in the delay naming task for native listeners. Y-axis shows the consistency index. 0 means low consistency and 1 means high consistency. And x-axis shows the time. Blue color indicates small pupil dilation. Green color indicates medium pupil dilation. Yellow color indicates large pupil dilation. Similar to the figure we saw earlier, pupil dilation becomes greater over time as the color changes from blue to yellow, from left to right. And reduced pronunciations induce greater dilation than unreduced counterparts, as the panel in the right-hand side displays more yellow color than the panel in the left-hand side. We can also observe a more clear consistency effect for reduced pronunciations, as evidenced by the red diagonal lines in the right-hand side panel, where larger pupil dilation comes earlier for low consistency words than for high consistency words. And this figure shows the interaction for L2 advanced learners. We can observe a slightly stronger consistency effect for reduced pronunciations, as evidenced by the red diagonal lines in the panel of the right-hand side. However, the direction of the consistency effect is opposite to what we observed in native listeners, where larger pupil dilation comes earlier for high consistency words than for low consistency words. Finally, I found the effect of pronunciation to spelling consistency depends on L2 pronunciations. For instance, this figure shows the interaction between consistency and time for reduced pronunciations in the delay naming task for L2 advanced learners. As I mentioned earlier, we can observe a consistency effect as evidenced by the red diagonal lines in the yellow area. The middle figure shows the interaction for L2 intermediate learners for reduced pronunciations. The consistency effect is weaker for intermediate learners than for advanced learners, as indicated by less diagonal lines. Finally, the leftmost figure shows the interaction for L2 basic learners. The consistency effect is weaker and it demonstrates a slightly different pattern. Taken all together, I will discuss the implication of these results. Implication of the result are as follows. First, a number of studies on the consistency effect discuss the importance of implementation of orthography in the spoken word recognition model. My perception studies also highlighted the importance of orthography, particularly for the processing of reduced pronunciations. So we need to study further about which spoken word recognition model can incorporate the orthography and how we can implement that. Second, our application of pupillometry to the study of both consistency and the reduced speech is novel. While the measurement of pupil dilation has been used to investigate various aspects of spoken language, our study represents the applicability of that method to examine such effects. Pupillometry allows us to investigate the degree and the time course of such effects without overt tasks or behavioral responses. This is particularly beneficial for participants who would have difficulty performing a specific task, such as pre-verbal children or people with aphasia. Finally, I found that the phonetic validation matters for the effect of consistency, meaning that I believe it is important to study about reduced speech and reduced pronunciation to a common form of language that we use when we communicate. So I believe that it is more ecologically valid to use such pronunciation when we study about speech communication. However, I understand that it is challenging to employ reduced pronunciation in a tightly controlled experiment. At least my studies have provided additional attempts to demonstrate how we can study about reduced pronunciations or how we can conduct an experiment using reduced pronunciations. For the limitations and the future direction of study, one of the limitations of my study is that I made the assumption that orthographic information is associated with only logographic scripts, despite the fact that Japanese allows for the use of the 3 types of scripts, which raises a question about the nature of orthographic information in Japanese. That is, whether Japanese orthographic representation contains information of all the possible forms of orthography, or they are only associated with a typical form of orthography. This is an important issue because when we calculate the consistency, we use a typical form of orthography. However, if we need to consider a typical form of orthography as well, the consistency could differ within a single word, whether it's written in the typical form or atypical form of orthography. A possible future experiment to address this issue could be a series of eye-tracking experiments in order to identify what kind of orthographic information is activated and at what point in time the activation occurs. In fact, this potential study was part of studying my dissertation, but due to the time constraint, I had to leave before future study. In conclusion, in my dissertation, I found a high degree of phonetic reduction in spontaneous speech, and these acoustically reduced pronunciations cause both L1 and L2 listeners to incur additional processing costs. And both L1 and L2 listeners utilize orthographic knowledge to increase efficacy in the processing of such reduced pronunciations, which suggests that the pronunciation to spelling consistency plays an important role in the processing of reduced speech for both L1 and L2 listeners. Thank you for listening.